The transport ship HMCS Magnificent cut through the Pacific waters on March 15, 1953, carrying soldiers who had never seen combat but had grown up hearing stories of Vimy Ridge and Dieppe. Most were from small towns along the St. Lawrence River, places where everyone knew everyone, where French was the language of home and heart. Now they were headed to a peninsula most had never heard of until 6 months ago, to fight in what the newspapers were calling a police action, but what everyone knew was a war. Private Jean-Claude Mercier stood at the rail, watching the wake spread behind the ship. He was 19 years old, from Trois-Rivières, and he had lied about his age to enlist. In his breast pocket was a letter from his mother, written in careful cursive French, warning him to keep his head down and trust in the Virgin Mary. In his other pocket was a photograph of a girl named Marie-Claire, who had promised to wait for him. He touched both pockets unconsciously, a ritual he would repeat thousands of times over the coming months. Beside him, Corporal Henri Beauchamp lit a cigarette, cupping his hands against the salt wind. Beauchamp was 24, a veteran of nothing except 3 years of peacetime garrison duty in Valcartier. He had joined to escape working in his father's lumber mill, and now he wondered if sawdust and monotony might not have been preferable to whatever waited for them across this ocean. Tu penses à quoi? Beauchamp asked, exhaling smoke that was immediately torn away by the wind. Je pense que c'est loin de chez nous, Mercier replied. I'm thinking it's far from home. Beauchamp laughed, a short bark without much humour. Mon ami, we haven't even gotten there yet. Below deck, in the cramped quarters where 200 men tried to sleep in shifts, Sergeant Major Paul Gauthier was reviewing maps by flashlight. Gauthier was 32, old by infantry standards, a man who had spent his teenage years in Montreal's East End learning to fight in alleys before the army had channeled that violence into something more structured. He had a wife in Quebec City and a daughter he had seen exactly twice, born 2 weeks before his deployment orders came through. Her name was Sophie, and he carried her hospital photograph wrapped in waxed paper to keep it dry. The maps showed terrain that looked simple on paper: hills, valleys, rivers, grid coordinates that meant nothing until you walked the ground, until you learned which ridge gave you fields of fire and which fold in the earth would get you killed. Gauthier had been studying these maps for 6 weeks, memorizing elevations and approaches, trying to build a picture in his mind of a place he had never seen. Lieutenant Marc Dufresne, the company commander, stopped beside Gauthier's bunk. Dufresne was 26, fresh from officer training, with a degree in history from Université Laval and exactly 0 hours of combat experience. He tried not to show how much this terrified him. Sergeant Major, les hommes, comment vont-ils? How are the men? Gauthier looked up from his maps. Ils ont peur, mon lieutenant, comme nous tous. They're scared, like all of us. Dufresne nodded. This was honest, at least. Better than the false bravado some of the other officers displayed. Et vous? Vous êtes prêts? And you? Are you ready? Gauthier folded the map carefully. On ne peut jamais être prêt pour la guerre, monsieur. On peut seulement être préparé. You can never be ready for war, sir. You can only be prepared. The ship docked at Busan on March 22, 1953, in rain that turned the port into a maze of mud and confusion. The men of the Royal 22e Regiment filed down gangplanks carrying everything they owned, weapons wrapped in oilcloth, boots already soaking through. The smell hit them first, a combination of diesel fuel, human waste, and something else. Something acrid they would later learn was the smell of a country that had been burning for 3 years. Trucks waited to take them north, ancient American vehicles that belched black smoke and rattled over roads that were barely more than tracks. They drove through villages where old women watched them pass with expressions that held neither welcome nor hostility, just a bone-deep exhaustion. They passed columns of refugees heading south, entire families carrying their possessions on their backs or in handcarts, children with eyes too old for their faces. Mercier watched from the back of a truck as a small boy, maybe 7 years old, stood beside the road holding a crude wooden rifle, pretending to shoot at the convoy. The boy's face was serious, intent, playing at the only game he had ever known. Mercier raised his hand in a wave, but the boy just stared, lowered his toy weapon, and turned away. "C'est fucked up," Beauchamp muttered beside him, using the English curse word because sometimes French did not quite capture the particular flavour of what they were seeing. They reached the forward area on March 25th, replacing a British unit that looked like they had aged a decade in their time on the line. The British sergeant who briefed Dufresne spoke in clipped tones about patrol routes and defensive positions, pointing at features on a map that corresponded poorly to the actual terrain. "The Chinese are professional," the British sergeant said, "not like the North Koreans. They're patient. They'll probe your defences for weeks, learning your patterns, and then they'll hit you when you think nothing's happening. Watch the listening posts. They're very good at infiltration." That first night, on Hill 187, April 12, 1953, the Vandus learned what quiet meant. Not the quiet of a peaceful countryside, but a quiet that pressed against your eardrums. A quiet that made every small sound, a pebble rolling down the slope, a branch breaking in the wind, seem like the prelude to violence. The hill itself was unremarkable, one of thousands of anonymous elevations that had become valuable only because men were willing to kill for them. It rose approximately 187 meters above the surrounding terrain, hence its designation. From its crest, you could see the Samichon Valley stretching north toward Chinese positions, a landscape of ruined villages and shell-cratered fields. The Canadian positions were a network of trenches and bunkers connected by communication trenches, all reinforced with sandbags and logs. The previous occupants had done the basic work, but Gautier immediately saw weaknesses. The fields of fire were adequate but not optimal. The wire obstacles needed strengthening. The approaches from the north offered too much dead ground where an attacking force could assemble unseen. "On a 3 semaines," Gautier told his squad leaders. 3 semaines pour transformer cette colline en forteresse. "We have 3 weeks. 3 weeks to turn this hill into a fortress." They worked like men possessed. During the day, they improved positions, strung additional barbed wire, laid mines in patterns that seemed random but were actually carefully calculated to channel any assault into killing zones. At night, they sent out listening posts, small teams of 2 or 3 men who would creep down the forward slope and hide in the darkness, listening for movement, for the whisper of cloth against vegetation, for the metallic click that might be a weapon being readied. Mercier pulled listening post duty on his 4th night on the hill, paired with Beauchamp. They moved out after full darkness at 2200 hours, crawling through a gap in the wire and down the slope to a position about 50 meters forward of the main line. The position was a shallow scrape in the earth, barely deep enough to hide 2 men, with a field telephone connecting them back to the company command post. They lay there in the darkness, trying to breathe quietly, trying not to move, listening to the night sounds of a country at war. In the distance, they could hear artillery, a constant low rumble like thunder that never ended. Closer, there were the small sounds of animals, insects, the wind moving through grass, and underneath it all, the sound of their own hearts beating, blood rushing in their ears. At 01:30 hours, Beauchamp touched Mercier's arm. He had heard something. They both froze, straining to hear. There it was again, a soft sound like someone moving carefully through brush. It could have been an animal. It could have been the wind. It could have been Chinese scouts. Beauchamp reached for the telephone, cranked it once very softly. The company command post answered immediately, Sergeant Major Gautier's voice barely a whisper through the handset. "Poste d'écoute 1, possible mouvement, secteur nord-est. Listening post 1, possible movement, northeast sector. Compris, restez silencieux." Understood, stay quiet. They lay there for another 2 hours, barely breathing, hearing nothing more. When their relief came at 0400, they crawled back through the wire soaked with dew and their own sweat, muscles cramped from lying motionless. Gautier was waiting for them. "Vous avez bien fait," he said. "Mieux signaler 10 fausses alertes qu'en manquer une vraie." You did well. Better to report 10 false alarms than miss one real one. This became the rhythm of their lives. Improve positions during the day, stand watch at night, send out patrols into no man's land, wait for something to happen. The waiting was harder than the work. The waiting gave you time to think, to remember home, to wonder if Marie-Claire was really waiting or had already found someone else, someone who had not sailed across an ocean to crouch in mud on a hill that did not even have a real name. By the 3rd week of April, the Van Dusen had transformed Hill 187 into something that would have impressed the engineers at Valcartier. Every bunker had overhead cover thick enough to withstand anything except a direct hit from heavy artillery. The communication trenches zigzagged to prevent enfilade fire. The wire obstacles now consisted of 3 belts of concertina wire, with the middle belt booby-trapped with grenades rigged to tripwires. Gautier had personally walked every metre of the defensive perimeter, memorizing sight lines, calculating fields of fire, identifying the weak points that no amount of preparation could entirely eliminate. Lieutenant Dufresne had proven himself better than expected. He listened to his sergeants, made decisions quickly, and did not pretend to know things he did not. On April 19th, during a company meeting in the command bunker, he spread out aerial photographs that had arrived from division headquarters. "Regardez ici," he said, pointing to features in the photographs. "Ces tranchées, ici et ici, elles sont nouvelles. Les Chinois se préparent à quelque chose. Look here. These trenches, here and here, they're new. The Chinese are preparing for something." The photographs showed Chinese positions approximately 800 meters north of Hill 187. In the past 2 weeks, new trenches had appeared, new bunkers, what looked like ammunition storage points. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone who understood military preparation. Captain Robert Nadeau, the battalion intelligence officer, had come up from the rear area to brief them. Nadeau was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses that seemed perpetually smudged with dust. He had been a schoolteacher in Sherbrooke before the war, teaching mathematics to teenagers who cared more about hockey than algebra. Now he taught a different kind of mathematics, the calculus of attack and defense. "Division pense qu'ils vont frapper quelque part le long de ce secteur dans les 2 prochaines semaines," Nadeau said, tracing a line on the map. "Les pourparlers d'armistice sont au point mort. Les Chinois veulent une dernière victoire avant que tout s'arrête. Division thinks they're going to hit somewhere along this sector in the next 2 weeks. The armistice talks are stalled. The Chinese want one last victory before everything stops. Et nous sommes la cible la plus évidente," Gautier said. It was not a question. "And we're the most obvious target." Nadeau nodded. "Une colline tenue par une seule compagnie. Isolée. Si j'étais commandant chinois, c'est ce que je choisirais. A hill held by a single company. Isolated. If I were a Chinese commander, that's what I would choose." After Nadeau left, Dufresne gathered his platoon leaders and senior NCOs. The command bunker was cramped, barely large enough for 8 men to crowd around the map table. A single kerosene lantern provided dim light that made everyone's face look gaunt, haunted. "On a fait tout ce qu'on pouvait faire pour se préparer," Dufresne said. "Maintenant, on attend. We've done everything we can to prepare. Now we wait." Sergeant Alphonse Tremblay, who led 2nd Platoon, cleared his throat. Tremblay was from Chicoutimi, a logger's son who stood 6'3" and had hands like steel traps. "Mon lieutenant, les hommes demandent s'il y aura des renforts si ça devient mauvais." "Sir, the men are asking if there will be reinforcements if it gets bad." Dufresne looked at Gautier before answering. They both knew the truth. "Les renforts les plus proches sont à 40 minutes. Peut-être plus si les Chinois pilonnent les routes d'approche. On doit tenir par nous-mêmes. The nearest reinforcements are 40 minutes away. Maybe more if the Chinese shell the approach routes. We have to hold on our own." The men absorbed this in silence. 40 minutes was a lifetime in combat. 40 minutes was long enough to die a dozen times over. "Mais on a quelque chose qu'ils n'ont pas," Gauthier added. "On connaît ce terrain mieux qu'ils ne le connaîtront jamais. On a préparé chaque position. On sait exactement où ils vont venir et ce qu'on va faire quand ils arrivent. But we have something they don't have. We know this terrain better than they ever will. We've prepared every position. We know exactly where they're going to come from and what we're going to do when they arrive." On April 23rd, the Chinese artillery began what would later be called the softening up phase. Nothing heavy, just harassment fire, a few shells dropped randomly on Hill 187 every few hours, keeping the Canadians on edge, preventing them from sleeping soundly, testing their reactions. The first shell came at 1435 hours, screaming in from the north and exploding on the reverse slope, sending up a geyser of dirt and shrapnel that peppered the sandbags but hurt no one. Mercier was cleaning his rifle when it hit, and the sound made him drop the cleaning rod and dive for the nearest bunker. His heart hammered so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. After a moment, when no more shells came, he crawled out and retrieved the cleaning rod, his hands shaking slightly. Beauchamp, who had not moved from where he sat, smiled without humour. "Première fois? First time?" "Oui? Yes." "Ça devient pas plus facile, juste plus familier." "It doesn't get easier, just more familiar." The harassment fire continued for a week. Sometimes it was a single shell. Sometimes it was a brief barrage of 5 or 6 rounds, never enough to do serious damage, but enough to keep everyone tense, jumpy, exhausted. Sleep became something you grabbed in 20-minute intervals, always with one ear listening for the whistle of incoming rounds. On April 28th, the pattern changed. At 0600 hours, a full battery of Chinese artillery opened up on Hill 187. Heavy rounds that shook the earth and collapsed parts of trenches and sent men scrambling for the deepest bunkers they could find. The barrage lasted 12 minutes, and when it stopped, the silence was almost as shocking as the noise had been. Gauthier immediately ordered a damage assessment. 2 bunkers had taken direct hits, collapsing their roofs but not penetrating deep enough to kill the men inside. 3 men had been wounded by shrapnel, none seriously. The wire obstacles had been torn up in several places, but the basic defensive structure had held. "Ils testent nos défenses," Gauthier told Dufresne. "Ils veulent voir comment on réagit, combien de temps il nous faut pour réparer les dégâts." They're testing our defenses. They want to see how we react, how long it takes us to repair the damage. "Alors on leur montre rien," Dufresne replied. "On répare tout cette nuit, sans lumière, sans bruit. Then we show them nothing. We repair everything tonight, no lights, no noise." That night, working in complete darkness, the Vendus repaired the wire, rebuilt the collapsed bunker roofs, redistributed ammunition. They worked in silence except for whispered commands in French that the Chinese listening posts, if they were out there, would not understand. By dawn on April 29th, Hill 187 looked exactly as it had before the barrage, showing no signs of damage, no indication of weakness. The Chinese tried again on April 30th, this time with a longer barrage that lasted 25 minutes and included some heavier caliber rounds that Nadeau later identified as 122mm howitzers. Again, damage was repaired overnight. Again, the hill showed no weakness. On May 1st, the artillery stopped entirely. The silence felt wrong, ominous, like the stillness before a storm. Gauthier doubled the listening posts, sending out 6 teams instead of the usual 3, spacing them around the entire perimeter of Hill 187. He also requested and received additional ammunition, cases of grenades, extra belts for the Bren guns, flares for the mortar teams. In the command bunker that evening, Dufresne reviewed the defense plan one more time with his platoon leaders. 1st Platoon, under Lieutenant Jean Fortin, held the northern slope, the most likely avenue of attack. 2nd Platoon, under Sergeant Tremblay, held the western approach. 3rd Platoon, led by Lieutenant Michel Bergeron, covered the eastern side. Headquarters section and the mortar team were positioned on the reverse slope, protected from direct fire but ready to provide support. Les mortiers, Dufresne said to Corporal André Leclerc, who commanded the mortar section. Vous avez tous les points de référence enregistrés? The mortars. You have all the reference points registered? Leclerc nodded. Over the past 3 weeks, he had personally fired ranging rounds at every likely assembly area within 1,000 meters of Hill 187, carefully recording the exact settings needed to hit each target. His notebook contained dozens of entries. Point Alpha, Azimuth 0 Fiend, charge phare, 7 rounds. Point Bravoure, Azimuth 032, charge 3, 5 rounds. He could drop rounds on any of these points in less than 30 seconds. Parfait, Dufresne said. Parce que quand ça commence, ça va être le chaos. On va avoir besoin de ces mortiers pour briser leurs assauts. Perfect. Because when it starts, it's going to be chaos. We are going to need those mortars to break up their assaults. At 2200 hours on May 2nd, 1953, Private Mercier and Corporal Beauchamp were manning Listening Post 3, positioned about 70 meters down the northeastern slope of Hill 187. The night was dark, no moon, clouds covering the stars. Visibility was maybe 20 meters at best. They had been in position for 2 hours, lying in their shallow scrape, listening to nothing but the usual night sounds. At 22:47 hours, Beauchamp heard it first. Not a sound exactly, but the absence of sound. The insects had stopped chirping. The night had gone completely silent. He touched Mercier's arm, then reached very slowly for the field telephone. Before he could crank it, they both heard it. Movement, lots of movement, the sound of many men trying to move quietly and not quite succeeding. The rustle of equipment, the scrape of boots on rock, whispered commands in a language neither of them understood. Beauchamp cranked the telephone 3 times rapidly, the emergency signal. Gautier's voice came through the handset immediately. Qu'est-ce qui se passe? What's happening? Mouvement massif, secteur nord-est. Ils arrivent. Massive movement. Northeast sector. They're coming. Combien? How many? Beauchamp listened to the sounds growing louder in the darkness. Beaucoup. Vraiment beaucoup. Many. Really many. Rentrez maintenant. Vite. Come back now. Fast. They crawled backward out of their position, moving as quickly as they dared, expecting at any moment to hear shots, to feel bullets tearing through the darkness. Behind them, the sounds of movement grew louder. The Chinese were no longer trying to be quiet. They knew they had been detected, and now speed mattered more than stealth. Mercier and Beauchamp tumbled through the gap in the wire at 22:53 hours, just as the first Chinese troops triggered the mines on the lower slope. The explosions lit up the night in flashes of orange and white, and in those brief moments of illumination, everyone on Hill 187 could see what was coming. Hundreds of Chinese soldiers, maybe thousands, moving up the slope in waves, assault rifles held ready, some already firing, tracer rounds arcing through the darkness like deadly fireflies. The first illumination flare went up at 22:54 hours, launched by Corporal Leclerc's mortar team. It burst 300 meters above the northern slope, a magnesium sun that turned night into day and froze the battlefield in stark black and white. What it revealed made even the veterans catch their breath. Chinese infantry covered the slope like ants, hundreds visible in just this one sector, more emerging from the darkness beyond the flare's reach. They moved in organized groups, squads and platoons, advancing in coordinated rushes, some providing covering fire while others bounded forward. This was not the human wave attack of propaganda, but professional infantry executing a well-planned assault. Feu à volonté. Gautier's voice cut through the moment of shocked silence. Fire at will. The Canadians opened up with everything they had. The Bren guns began their distinctive rapid hammering, firing in short bursts that walked tracers across groups of advancing Chinese soldiers. Riflemen picked their targets, fired, worked their bolts, fired again. The two Vickers machine guns positioned on the flanks opened up with long, sustained bursts that cut swaths through the attackers. Mercier found himself at his position in 1st Platoon's main trench, his Lee Enfield rifle pressed against his shoulder, firing at shapes that appeared in the flare light. He tried to remember his training: breathe, aim, squeeze, don't jerk the trigger. But his heart was racing, and his hands were shaking, and the rifle seemed to buck wildly with each shot. Beside him, Beauchamp fired with mechanical precision, working his bolt so smoothly it seemed almost casual, despite the chaos erupting around them. The Chinese soldiers were shouting now, a rhythmic cry that rose above the gunfire. Some carried bugles that blared sharp notes, signals that meant nothing to the Canadians, but organized the Chinese assault into waves. The first wave hit the outer wire at 2257 hours, soldiers throwing themselves against the barbed wire, some carrying wire cutters, others simply trying to push through by force. Canadian grenades arced through the air, Mills bombs that exploded with sharp cracks, sending shrapnel tearing through the men at the wire. The booby-trapped grenades in the wire began detonating as soldiers triggered the tripwires, each explosion creating a brief gap in the attacking wave. "Mortier! Point Alpha!" Gauthier shouted into the field telephone that connected him to Leclerc's position. 5 seconds later, the first mortar rounds began falling on Point Alpha, a depression about 200 meters down the slope where the Chinese were assembling their second wave. The rounds fell with precision, explosion after explosion walking across the assembly area. Leclerc had practiced this fire mission a dozen times. Now he executed it perfectly, adjusting fire based on the explosions he could see, dropping rounds exactly where they would do the most damage. At 2301 hours, a group of Chinese soldiers broke through the wire in 1st Platoon's sector, maybe 20 men who charged up the slope toward the main trench line. Lieutenant Fortin, commanding 1st Platoon, stood up in the trench with a Thompson submachine gun and emptied an entire magazine into the attacking group at a range of 15 meters. Most went down, but 3 reached the trench and jumped in. What followed was hand-to-hand fighting, brutal and close. Mercier found himself grappling with a Chinese soldier who seemed impossibly strong, younger than Mercier, but with eyes that held no fear, only determination. They struggled for control of Mercier's rifle, both straining, neither gaining advantage. Then Beauchamp was there, bringing his rifle butt down on the Chinese soldier's head with a sickening crack. "Merci," Mercier gasped. "Thanks. Pas le temps." No time. More Chinese soldiers were at the wire now, and more were breaking through. The Canadian fire was accurate and disciplined, but there were simply so many targets. For every Chinese soldier that fell, 2 more appeared to take his place. At 2308 hours, Dufresne made a decision that would later be studied in infantry tactics courses. Instead of reinforcing the point where the Chinese had achieved their breakthrough, he ordered 2nd Platoon to shift positions slightly, moving to where they could fire directly into the flank of the penetration. Sergeant Tremblay's men moved quickly, taking up new positions in a communication trench that gave them a perfect angle. When the next group of Chinese soldiers broke through the wire and charged toward what they thought was a gap in the Canadian line, they ran directly into enfilade fire from 2nd Platoon. The Bren guns caught them in a crossfire from which there was no escape. The penetration collapsed, the Chinese soldiers either falling where they stood or retreating back down the slope. But the pressure continued. At 23:15 hours, Chinese troops hit the western slope, Tremblay's original sector, now lightly held after his platoon had shifted position. A Canadian corporal named Denis Bouchard found himself commanding a position with only 3 other men, facing what looked like a full Chinese platoon advancing through the darkness. "On va tenir," Bouchard told his men. "Peu importe quoi, on tient. We're going to hold. No matter what, we hold." They fired as fast as they could work their bolts, burned through their ammunition in minutes, threw every grenade they had. When the Chinese were 10 meters away, Bouchard grabbed the field telephone and called for mortar fire on his own position. "Tu es sûr?" Leclerc demanded. "You're sure? Fais-le, maintenant. Do it, now." Leclerc dropped 3 rounds right on Bouchard's position. The 4 Canadians had hugged the bottom of their trench, covering their heads. The Chinese soldiers, caught in the open, had no protection. When the smoke cleared, Bouchard and his men emerged shaken but alive, surrounded by bodies. The pattern repeated across Hill 187. The Chinese would mass for an assault. The Canadian mortars would break it up. The Chinese would achieve a small penetration. Canadian fire from unexpected angles would seal it. The Chinese would probe for weaknesses and find that the Canadians had prepared for every contingency. At 23:42 hours, there was a lull. The Chinese pulled back, regrouping, leaving behind dead and wounded on the slopes. The Canadians used the pause to redistribute ammunition, tend to their own wounded, reinforce positions that had been damaged. Casualties had been surprisingly light, 7 wounded, none killed, but ammunition was running low. Gautier moved from position to position, checking on his men, making sure everyone had enough rounds to continue fighting. He found Mercier sitting with his back against the trench wall, hands shaking as he tried to reload magazines. "Tu tiens le coup?" Gautier asked. "You holding up?" Mercier nodded, not trusting his voice. "C'est correct d'avoir peur," Gautier said, loading magazines beside him with steady hands. "Juste continue de faire ton travail." "It's okay to be afraid. Just keep doing your job." "Combien de temps encore?" "How much longer?" Gautier looked out at the darkness where they could hear Chinese voices, officers reorganizing their forces. "Jusqu'à ce qu'ils arrêtent de venir, ou jusqu'à ce qu'on n'ait plus de balles, peu importe ce qui arrive en premier. Until they stop coming, or until we run out of bullets, whichever comes first." In the command bunker, Dufresne was on the radio with battalion headquarters, requesting ammunition resupply and updating them on the situation. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Jacques Dextraz, listened to the report and made a quick decision. "On envoie des munitions maintenant," Dextraz said through the static. "Ça devrait arriver dans 20 minutes. Peux-tu tenir jusque-là?" "We're sending ammunition now. Should arrive in 20 minutes. Can you hold until then?" "On va tenir," Dufresne replied. "On n'a pas le choix. We'll hold. We have no choice." The ammunition convoy left the battalion rear area at 23:55 hours, 2 trucks loaded with cases of rifle ammunition, Bren gun magazines, grenades, and mortar rounds. They drove without lights through darkness, following a road that the Chinese artillery had been pounding for weeks, knowing that at any moment they might drive into a barrage or an ambush. At 00:12 hours on May 3rd, the Chinese attacked again. This time they came from 3 directions simultaneously, north, west, and east, trying to split the Canadian defensive fire, force them to defend everywhere at once. It was a sound tactical decision, the kind of coordinated assault that required good communications and professional leadership. But Gautier had anticipated this. He had positioned his Vickers machine gun specifically to create interlocking fields of fire that covered all 3 approaches. When the Chinese attacked from multiple directions, they found themselves under fire from weapons they could not see, could not suppress, positioned in bunkers that were almost impossible to destroy without direct hits from heavy artillery. The fighting intensified. Chinese soldiers reached the wire in all 3 sectors, some breaking through, forcing the Canadians to fight them in the trenches. Grenades exploded in confined spaces, filling the air with shrapnel and smoke. Men fought with rifle butts, with bayonets, with their bare hands when weapons jammed or ran dry. Lieutenant Bergeron, commanding 3rd Platoon on the eastern slope, took shrapnel in the shoulder at 00:23 hours but refused to leave his position. He directed fire with his left hand while a medic wrapped his wound, calling out targets, encouraging his men, maintaining the disciplined fire that was keeping the Chinese at bay. At 00:31 hours, the ammunition convoy reached the base of Hill 187. Under covering fire from Canadian positions, Korean porters grabbed the ammunition cases and ran up the hill, dodging mortar rounds that the Chinese were now dropping on the approach routes. They made 3 trips, carrying enough ammunition to keep the defenders fighting for another hour. Leclerc's mortar team had been firing almost continuously for 40 minutes. The mortar tubes were so hot they had to pour water on them to prevent warping. Leclerc himself had burned his hands on the metal, but he kept firing, kept adjusting, kept dropping rounds on every Chinese assembly area he could identify. At 0047 hours, something changed in the rhythm of the Chinese assault. Their fire slackened, the waves of attackers became less organized, more hesitant. Officers could be heard shouting, trying to rally their troops, but the response was weaker. Gautier noticed it first. Ils commencent à craquer, he told Dufresne. They're starting to break. Comment tu sais? How do you know? Écoute. Leurs officiers crient plus fort. Les hommes répondent moins. Ils ont pris trop de pertes. Listen. Their officers are shouting louder. The men are responding less. They've taken too many casualties. At 0105 hours, the Chinese began a fighting withdrawal, pulling back in organized groups, some providing covering fire while others retreated. The Canadians let them go, too exhausted to pursue, content to hold what they had defended so desperately. By 0130 hours, the slopes of Hill 187 were quiet, except for the moans of wounded men, Chinese mostly, left behind in the withdrawal. Canadian medics moved forward cautiously, checking the fallen, providing aid where they could, both to their own wounded and to enemy soldiers who would otherwise bleed out in the darkness. Mercier sat in his trench position, his rifle across his knees, too tired to even remove his helmet. Around him, other soldiers slumped against the trench walls, faces blackened with powder smoke, hands blistered from firing hundreds of rounds, eyes haunted by what they had seen and done. Beauchamp offered him a canteen. Tu as bien fait, he said. You did well. Mercier drank, the water tasting like metal and dust. J'ai tué des hommes. I killed men. Oui. Et ils essayaient de nous tuer. C'est la guerre. Yes. And they were trying to kill us. That's war. Ça va changer quelque chose? Cette colline, ce combat? Will it change anything? This hill, this fight? Beauchamp looked out at the darkness where hundreds of Chinese soldiers had fallen. Probablement pas. Mais on est toujours en vie. Pour le moment, c'est assez. Probably not. But we're still alive. For now, that's enough.